opportunity to briefly meet John, but I want to introduce John Steinman, and he has very graciously altered his travel schedule to work in a stop here in Grand Rapids on his, he was in Duluth at a conference, and then he went over to Virginia to do a presentation for their food co-op. And at the last minute, after I reached out to him, he's extremely responsive and just immediately agreed to try to stop here today and do a presentation. I gave him some information about us being a startup co-op, and I wasn't trying to give him a sob story or anything. And he gave us he worked with us, gave us a very affordable speaking fee for being here. He's really bent over backwards to be here today, and we really appreciate it. He has been in the food co-op world for many, many years. We just had coffee, and the depth of his knowledge is remarkable. And he's drawing on it today to talk to us on multiple presentations that he's given in his stops and meetings with other food co-ops and lessons learned. So from Canada, there's John Steinman.
All the way from Canada via Virginia. And before that, Duluth. I was at, I don't know if you mentioned that part, I was down at the CCMA conference in Duluth, and so 300 or so people from all over the country, mostly the US. I think I was one of the only Canadians, if not the only Canadian, at the conference. Storefront co-ops, and co-ops, of course, that are already open, gather every year at different places across the country, and this year was in Duluth, so this is how all of this came to be. And then from here, I go back down to the cities, to Minneapolis, and I'll spend 3 days with the East Side Food Co-op. Are any of you familiar with the East Side Food Co-op?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So they're one of the younger of the co-ops in that area, like just over 20 years, I think, that co-op's been around. So I have a better sense of all of you and your backgrounds and experience with the co-op. Is anybody here to learn about the co-op for the first time? Yeah, okay. So just one of you, and otherwise you're all members. Are you a member yet? No, okay. And everyone else is a member, board. Volunteer.
Board.
Okay, good. Well, so, I'll do my best to offer a little bit of introduction as I can. I know one of the ideas too with this talk was to support all of you to be able to better sell this idea of a co-op, and how do we talk about why these co-ops are important. So I'll incorporate some of that into what I want to share. And my hope also is to keep you motivated doing what you're doing. You're in the midst of this capital campaign, I understand, almost at the halfway mark soon. And it's a lot of work, and I know I was here in 2019. It's amazing that you're still doing this work 6 years later. I don't know how many years you were doing it beforehand, but I want to at least offer some sort of boost, and that's kind of one of my goals as well. And, I just want to get it out right away. Since I was here, a lot has changed in the world, particularly here in the US, and I want to just identify this unique time that we're in, because I think it's made what food co-ops are and all co-ops highly more relevant, much more relevant than they were before. And I wanted to speak to that from the perspective of a Canadian.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes, this is what we're supposed to always be saying, right?
Yeah.
This is the stereotype of me. So yeah, I received many apologies. Thank you very much. But I just want to speak to something that's been so fascinating for me to see in Canada. Has been, in the past few months, as you may know, Canadians have sort of rallied in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime living in Canada. I'm 45, I'm probably paying attention more for the past 30 years to these kinds of things. And I've never seen Canadians rally behind something and get united behind something, regardless of their political perspectives, regardless of their ideologies, and say, we want to support our Canadian manufacturers and producers, given, all of what's going on. And it really just reminds me of the power of people, groups of people and communities to really respond to emergencies, to respond to urgent situations and critical situations. And it certainly reminds me of the COVID time when we saw people come together in a way that I had also never seen before to support one another, again, regardless regardless of political differences, regardless of ideologies. People came together to support one another. We saw it more recently in Los Angeles with the fires, where entire communities just really mobilized themselves to really support one another. And why I think that's important is that, you know, co-ops have followed a very similar trajectory over the past 150 or so years. Minnesota has a long history of co-op development and continues to have many food co-ops and other types of co-ops. And what's often generated interest in co-ops have been disruptions, emergencies, failures of government, failures of the private sector to serve people's needs. And as far as what motivates co-ops, we haven't yet come to some real strong disruption where we've been uncomfortable enough to really all get behind co-ops in a way that just makes their potential of opening easy, you know, and yet I think there are a lot of emergencies and disruptions that are there that justify a co-op, which I'm sure has driven most of you to be wanting to be involved, but they're not as apparent as a fire in Los Angeles, or as a pandemic, or what's happening between the US and Canada. You know, they're a bit more hidden. So I want to kind of speak to some of that as a way to help all of you be able to talk about your co-op, relate to your co-op, in the midst of your capital campaign, to be able to answer questions and motivate people to invest in this important initiative with what you're doing. So I think part of that, so with that as a preamble, I think part of that is starting to change the narrative as far as how we relate to grocery stores, how we relate to our communities, and how we relate to co-ops. And so I want to offer an example of this. So who here owns a bank? Who here owns a bank? Which bank do you own? Okay. Who here is a member of a credit union? Okay, so just one of you. So I often bring this question up in many communities. I was in Goldendale, Washington recently, and Castlegar, British Columbia recently, and I asked that very same question. And then when I asked who here's a member, no one puts up their hand when I ask who owns a bank. And then when I ask who here's a member of a credit union, usually half the room puts up their hand. Because in those communities, credit unions are very present. And so I bring that up as an example because there are many examples in our communities of businesses and services that we own. So when I introduce myself, I get introduced as an author of a book about food co-ops or a former board director of a food co-op. I also introduce myself as an owner of a bank. So this is the bank that I own. This is the Nelson District Credit Union. So of course I don't own this bank just by myself, I own it with 4,000 other people. And so some of these examples I'm sharing, also I want to bring attention to how important each of these institutions are to different aspects of our lives. So financial institutions, absolutely essential. You know? I don't know if it wasn't for the credit union, I wouldn't have got such a great mortgage on my home. I live in a co-housing community and was part of that development, and they were the ones who offered the development loan. So I own the bank that holds my mortgage. I also own 25 vehicles in Nelson. Electric vehicles, low-speed electric vehicles, pickup trucks, vans. I'm not the only owner, I'm one of 350 owners. And so using the co-op model, we got together to say, you know, we want to take care of our transportation needs. Many people who are members are able to give up their car, or if they're a family with a single car, are able to balance some of the gaps, you know, in planning around transportation through the co-op. So this is the Kootenai Car Share Co-op. My first welcoming into co-ops and my welcoming into where I live in British Columbia was Kootenai Co-op Radio. So again, we've got financial institutions, transportation, and media. So of course we know so much of our media is becoming owned by fewer and fewer companies. If communities even of this size can sustain news media, which is becoming harder. So we have this co-op radio station being there for 26 years, owned by hundreds of people in our community, and it's where I got my start actually in food journalism, and where I recorded the audiobook of my book. See there on the left. I also own this gas station. This is the Slocan Valley Co-op. We own 6 gas stations in the area. Some of them have convenience stores, most of them have convenience stores, one of them has a liquor store. So again, fuel, very important need for those of us who haven't switched over to electric. And that co-op, the Slocan Valley Co-op, just last year purchased this restaurant and pub. So now I'm an owner of a pub with thousands of other people in the area. So this is an important pub because it's outside of where I live, and it really is one of the main gathering places for this little area, this community. So the co-op is now preserving it, and being owned by the people in the community. I'm an owner of a flour mill, so 35 of us own this flour mill here. This is an unincorporated co-op. So this is the Nelson Flour Milling Co-op, and so we buy local grains from farmers like Gales is there, and we have a key to the mill, and we're able to just self-serve and use the mill whenever we want. So food processing, financial institutions, media, transportation, what was the last one? Gathering places, restaurants, gas stations. And lastly, this is the grocery store that I own. So I own this with 18,000 people. We're in a city of 11,000, just like your city. And this co-op has been here in this community for 50 years. It started as a buying club in a basement. Sounds similar to, I think, the co-op that used to be here in Grand Rapids, as I understand. And eventually, in 2016, we moved into this building. So I was the board director of this co-op for 10 years. And when I left the board in 2016, I went off and wrote a book about food co-ops. So, this is part of the importance of co-ops in our communities, whether it's a food co-op or any other co-op. And what all of these do is allow us to embed democratic principles into the businesses and services that we use. And of course, now, I think more than ever, this idea of democracy is a very hot topic for obvious reasons. And this is another way that we can embed democracy in our lives. And I want to just share this important quote. This is a quote that's guided me through a lot of my interest in co-ops. It's actually the basis for the talk I'll give later today in Minneapolis. The absence of democracy in economics is a permanent threat to the survival of democracy in politics. Does anyone want to offer another way to understand what this is saying? What is this trying to say?
Yeah, money talks.
Money talks?
Capitalism. Yeah.
Yep. Money talks. And, an example of this would be we long believed and hoped that government institutions, public institutions, would be able to serve our needs, right? And part of that is to also help regulate and manage the economy, ensuring that no one company would ever get too powerful at any one time. And so more recently, you can look at the rise of social media as an example of a new industry that's formed that really has a lot of power. Many people are relying on it for their businesses and livelihoods. And so the US government, I know some years ago, said, hey, let's start regulating this industry, protect people and other businesses so that, they don't get too powerful. And before the government could do that, what happened? At least with one of those companies. You might remember it was acquired by the richest person on the planet. So Twitter was purchased by Elon Musk. And before we, the people, the public, could really regulate the industry, that amount of power and money was able to actually come in and regulate the industry, or at least that company itself, right? And so this is really the importance of co-ops, is to rebalance that power. We can embed democratic principles into the economy. And if we don't, we know that economic power that's concentrated to the hands of fewer and fewer people can actually start to control the very public institution that we call government. So this is how valuable co-ops are. So when being asked, what's the importance of this co-op? Why do we need it? Yes, it's about getting good local food and organic food and higher quality options, if that's, the interest. But it's also a big part about this democracy piece as well. I just want to show you this one chart that really helps look at this from a wider perspective over the past 100 years now, where we can actually see that when the share of wealth in a country becomes concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, we can see that what follows is generally the public responding to that inequality. And so what happened after the progressive era of the early 20th century that then peaked in the late 1920s there, what happened is government institutions were formed to help support people. So competition laws were introduced around that time. A few others here in the U.S. I know, like the Meat Inspection, the Pure Food and Drug Act was introduced. Labor laws were introduced to help protect workers. The Federal Reserve was introduced, the Department of Labor. All of these institutions were introduced to protect people. But those institutions are only as good as the next administration's interest to sustain them, right? So a lot of those efforts after the 1920s led to what's known in that period between these two peaks and spikes as the Great Compression, which allowed for middle class to form, income inequality to decrease, and there was much more equal wealth equity wealth equality across the country, across the U.S. And then a lot of that then started to erode, where those institutions and those laws were no longer enforced or supported. And we see where we are today, where we also now have, in the U.S., the highest wealth inequality in any country. So this is all, again, relevant to co-ops. And so just to capture what I was just talking about, the level of prosperity in a society is proportional to the democratic distribution of power. Conversely, the level of privilege and economic disparity in a society is proportional to its absence. So again, when we start to rebalance that power through co-ops, like the free range food co-op or credit unions or any of these other co-ops, we're actually not just addressing the need for a different kind of groceries, we're actually helping rebalance the wealth inequality in our communities and in the country by bringing democratic power into these businesses. And what truly conditions how people live and what societies will become is the degree to which people can exercise control over their lives and economics central to this. This is a quote from another author who wrote a book with my same publisher. And this again just captures what I've been saying. So this is really part of what inspired me to write this book, Grocery Story. I'm amazed that 6 years ago, I wrote this book and it's just become more and more relevant. To the point where I'm thinking maybe of a second edition, but what's in there is still highly relevant. I was so passionate about this, just so you can see how much of a geek I am about this. I decided I needed a van for my book. And with this van, I traveled all across the US and Canada. I spent 6 months in 2019 on 2 different trips, traveling to 130 food co-ops, visiting about 24 startups along the way, like yours. I slept about a third of the nights in the van, so I had a big bed in the back, and then underneath the bed was 1,500 books to begin with. And by the end of that trip, they were gone. Actually, I got more after that, so that was good. So this is in front of my co-op before I left. And on the back of my van, I had this question, which is really fundamental to so much of what I've been talking about. Who owns your grocery store? So sometimes I would purposely drive really slow, just so the people behind me contemplate this question even more. Whether or not that worked, I'll never know. And I want to share some examples recently of startups that have been at this for a long time and who have successfully opened their stores. This is, of course, where you're at. This is the Detroit People's Food Co-op, which last year opened its doors after over 10 years of work and perseverance. This is in a predominantly black community. The organizations that created the Detroit People's Food Co-op were black-led organizations. And this is a real big development in the history of co-ops, where the co-op model is actually being used to respond to what has been, systemic inequities that have led to many communities, often communities of color, without access to any grocery store whatsoever. And inside, this is what that co-op looks like. These are all leaders in the co-op movement and civil rights movements over the previous 100 years. Another author in the middle there, in her book, Collective Courage, which talks about the use of the co-op model over the past 150 or so years in black communities to help rebalance the distribution of power. Again, using an economic engine to do that, which is co-ops. So this is something I actually just created with this message. But, this "we the people" is something, of course, that everyone's familiar with, certainly in this country, not so much in Canada. But "we the people" is something that really represents democracy. It represents what a statement that really embodies democracy. And we do this by building grocery stores that are cooperatively owned. Here's just another story too, because in both of these cases, like the Detroit People's Food Co-op and this one here, there was like an urgency that really led to them to mobilize, right? And this urgency here was that this was the only grocery store on Marrowstone Island in Washington State, and it had been there for over 100 years, owned by an independent family. It burnt down, it had a fire, didn't quite burn down the whole building, but it gutted the inside of the store. And at that point, those owners were seeking retirement, and they decided this was going to be too much for them to have to rebuild the store. It's the only grocery store on the island, so that's an emergency. And the entire community came together very quickly in the span of months, invested in the store. I think it was about $350,000, $400,000 that they were able to pull together very quickly, and the entire community of Marrowstone Island purchased the co-op. And today, this is before today. This is the opening. This was just last year, and this is what it looks like inside. And so, some of these examples I want to share because it's not really a question to me of if communities can build food co-ops. It's really just about your commitment to it. And I've seen every community of every size be able to successfully build a food co-op. Doesn't mean that's a shoo-in that it's going to work, because part of what we need to do is be able to inform, be able to speak to what is the urgencies. So I shared one example, through the democracy piece. In this case, these emergencies are much more acute. So it's harder for what you're doing, right? Because the emergency isn't necessarily as acute as, for example, these two. So I want to just offer some ideas for how to talk about this. And some of it came out of my time as a producer and host of a television show. I was a radio show host at that co-op radio station where I investigated the food system. And I came out of that experience over many years, about 7, 8 years, realizing that there was a piece within the system that we hadn't been bringing enough attention to as far as where is the greatest influence in the food system. And it was grocery stores. That's what I came to. And it was surprising to me because I would go to many conferences and many gatherings and people trying to change the food system, and nobody was talking about grocery stores. They were talking about farmers markets and CSAs and all of these really innovative models for how you get good food to people, but they weren't talking about grocery stores. So I just want to offer a way to really reflect on how important these institutions are, because the dominant relationship to these businesses is that this is a place I buy food. This is a business that sells food. It's a very transactional relationship. We walk in, we walk out, we don't think much about it. Except for some of you who are clearly thinking about it. But what about the people who aren't here, right? In the community who aren't here in this room? How do we talk about how important these businesses are? So I want to share what I came to. If you've read my book, you might already know this. But it's a good reminder that grocery stores, I've concluded, are the most powerful institutions shaping human health. And why is that? Well, we know food and health are deeply connected, thankfully. Some of us, no, not everyone yet. But human health and food are directly connected. 93% of all the food that we purchase for our homes is purchased at food retailers. So these are the institutions, really, I think, that are the most powerful shaping human health. It's not the healthcare system, in my opinion. It's where we get our food, which either spells good health or poor health. And so some of the greatest challenges that affect us, like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, even mental health, all of these conditions and concerns can be connected to what we eat. Grocery stores are the most influential institutions shaping our planet, our environment, our climate. As much as my way of transportation to Minnesota was using an airplane and contributing to some of this, what I always see out my window is just how food shapes the entire landscapes of the planet through agriculture. 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions come out of the food system. So as consumers, as eaters, as citizens, where can we have the greatest effect on that impact? It's through that one place where most of us are accessing food, grocery stores. Economy. So a grocery store either extracts wealth out of a community, particularly if it's an absentee landlord or if it is a company not based in the community, it extracts wealth, or it can help recirculate wealth. And lastly, I've come to believe grocery stores are the most influential institutions shaping food supply chains or the food system. And why is that? So here's an image to just imagine as you talk about your co-op and why it's important. This is a good image that I always use, and that I have in my book as well. So it's this representation of the entire food supply chain, right? Where we have 500 million people on the planet producing food, 8 billion of us eaters. And for all of that food to get from where it's produced to where it's consumed, it goes through a series of bottlenecks, which are generally controlled by a handful of companies. So these numbers represent just roughly like how many companies might be in each of those bottlenecks. So in any one country, in any one region, you'll have a handful of companies buying the raw ingredients, maybe up to 10 big companies, 12 I think in the the US that really control all of the processing and manufacturing of those products. There would be another bottleneck for distribution, and then you have the retailers here. Generally 5 companies controlling most of the grocery dollars. Case in point, here is what it looks like, just so you have some numbers to go on. Walmart controls right now 30% of the grocery market in the US, and the top 5 in the US control almost 65% of the grocery market. Canada, it's even higher. So 2 companies in Canada control 50% of the market, 3 almost 80%. And what does that look like in communities? Because sometimes it's not even representative of what's happening in the country, but a company like Walmart and some of these similar sized communities to yours have pure monopolies over the groceries in those communities. So Whitewater, Wisconsin, I know, has been working really hard to rebalance this because they are one of these, not on this list, but they are trying to build a food co-op to respond to this inequality of power. So another way to understand, this and the language that I use to help communicate this is that grocery stores really are the food systems control center. So here's an image to just kind of like evoke what that really looks like. So mass emission control replaced by all the grocers who really determine the future of food. Does everyone have any comments or questions about any of this? Any curiosities that are coming up? Feel free. We're a small group.
I would recommend, if anybody's interested, reading a book called The Space Merchants, which came out like The Space Merchants.
The Space Merchants, yep.
Yeah, and it came out, I don't know, I must have read it in the 70s or 80s, anyway, but it's a precursor to what is happening, like right here. It's a science fiction, it's a, look forward kind of thing.
Okay.
And it really, it's a small book.
This sounds like my kind of book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a very small book and it's interesting. And it's
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I want to share a story too that also helps emphasize the importance of cooperative ownership versus private ownership. So this was the first natural foods chain of 3 stores. It wasn't a big chain in Vancouver, British Columbia. It started in the 1980s. And it really operated just like a co-op in the sense that it cared about the food that was on the shelves, gave back money to its community, supported its workers. A lot of people, as I understood it, I wasn't there at the time, but a lot of people thought this was a co-op. But it wasn't. It was privately owned by a group of passionate, values-aligned individuals, one of which is a friend of mine. But because it was privately owned, it meant that as this industry became more and more valuable, which is the natural food sector in particular, that bigger companies might be interested in acquiring a company like this. So sure enough, a company from Colorado acquired. And the owners, Capers at the time, felt, I think, pretty good with this because Alfalfa's was values aligned. They weren't that big of a company. And they thought, Alfalfa's would preserve the values that they had invested over many years into this business. But what do you think that happened?
It didn't stay that way.
And why? What was that?
Money?
Yes. Any more specific? Well, Alfalfa's got acquired. So Alfalfa's got acquired
Yeah.
by Wild Oats. And does anyone know who acquired Wild Oats? The Western Natural Foods chain?
Amazon.
Almost. Whole Foods?
Yeah.
And who acquired Whole Foods?
Amazon.
Amazon. So this tiny little values-aligned group of entrepreneurs never imagined that 20 or so years later, 30 years actually later, that their little business that they created would be owned by one of the biggest companies on the planet, owned by one of the wealthiest people on the planet. And so part of that is because this was a privately owned business. So this is what those stores look like today. And what does that mean? It means that the people who are supplying the store, who really relied on that store, are no longer dealing with a locally owned business, they're dealing with a multinational company, right? And people who probably care less about their well-being and what they need. It also affects workers. So I found this stock image, which looks like quite an upsetting employee. It affects culture, it affects pay, it affects benefits, it affects the workers, the suppliers. And so this is where the co-op model becomes so important. So this also connects to democracy. Is if a grocery store is going to leave our community, should we rely on those stores not have a say in its future? Given how important, again, coming back to those 4 areas of impact, how important they are to human health, to our economy, to the environment, to the food system. And so what the co-op model does is it says to all of us in our communities, you can own this store by becoming a member, by becoming a shareholder, becoming a member owner. There's different ways in which that's called in food co-ops. And in doing so, you get to choose whether or not your co-op is sold one way or the other. So through the democratic process, like you see in this older photo, or in this little voting booth over at the sewer co-op in Minneapolis, we embed those democratic principles into the organization. And so to date, there has never been a food co-op that has been sold to private interests. Because in order for that to happen, the members would have to vote on that. It wouldn't be up to the CEO or the general manager, it wouldn't be up to the board. It's only up to the people who rely on that store, customers, the citizens, right? And the staff, if they're owners, and the suppliers, if they're owners as well. So this is why this model is so important to protect independent grocers. Here's a couple headlines, one from Canada, another from here in Minnesota. It's a big deal in Minnesota where rural communities are losing grocery stores or people are being acquired. And so this brings up the question too of accountability. So this is a word I think that's also really important, really helps speak to the importance of co-ops. So coming back to the areas of influence that these grocers have, who's holding all of these grocers accountable to these 4 areas of influence? Nobody. I mean, sometimes people answer with shareholders. Shareholders aren't holding those companies to account for this. They're holding them account to make money, ensuring they make a profit. Which is fascinating, right? Because in our communities, anything that is of importance to us, we generally have some protections through public institutions, regulations, but with food and grocery, that has never happened. It's been allowed to really be controlled entirely by shareholders and the owners of those businesses. So the co-op model, coming back to this, is a way for us to hold our grocery store accountable to all of these areas of influence. And if we aren't supportive of how our grocers align with those impacts and our values, then we can do something. We can vote, right? And even just our voice, beyond voting, has power. So again, coming back to what I was sharing earlier, cooperatives democratize the economy. And I just want to share too the history of this, because the history of this is important to understand that the formation of what's now the National Co-op Business Association, which represents all co-ops across the U.S., when it first began, it recognized that ethical consumption, which is this idea of voting with your dollars or boycotting, was never going to be enough. Because all we were doing with that was reforming the system and enabling it to continue. There's this other idea of government helping control industry in the economy. But what the founder had also said, and of course this would be connected to socialism, socialists want the government to take over business. We want the people directly to do it. So co-ops are not a form of socialism as it applies to government. It's not really about ethical consumerism. It's about actually combining some of this into this new model, which is the co-op model, where we, in effect, take on that sort of regulatory role. So when I saw this article in the Canadian newspaper, because Canada is starting to take regulatory action against grocery stores, or at least they say they will. I don't think that will happen, to be honest. But this is, again, an example of how, well, rather than rely on government, who every 4 years might change their ideologies and values to take on big business, we get to do it ourselves. And so I also want to speak about price, affordability, and trust. Because this, of course, is generally, from what I've heard, one of the big questions people have about co-ops. What are the prices on the shelves going to be? And price is connected to trust. And I want to just give an example of why that is. So So this is, I think, one of the most important pieces that precedes anything about price and affordability, is that food co-ops can't profit off of us. All the profits a food co-op makes are customer profits. And this image here, which many co-ops will use to help communicate this, describes how the co-op generates profits. So co-ops are for-profit businesses, and that's important to recognize. They're for-profit businesses, but those profits either go back into the store, reinvested into the store, which means everyone benefits, workers benefit, community benefits, or if the co-op generates more than it needs to reinvest back into the store, it actually returns that back to its owners. So in your case, that probably will take many, many years before you can do that, because you'll be paying off debt. My co-op built a new store only recently, in the past few years, started to return some of those profits to owners. Don't get excited about like retirement savings plan, because my portion was $20, and it's based on how much we purchase. So if we purchase a lot for a family of 4 or 5, it's probably going to be more than my $20. So this is also why we can trust that the prices being set on the shelves of the store are more reflective of the true cost of food, and we can trust that the grocer is not trying to take advantage of us. So that changes really our relationship to price, I think, in a lot of ways. If we can just trust that the people in the store have our best interests in mind. And it's a transparent organization, so we get to see the profits that a co-op makes, we get to see how they're made as owners. And so again, when we see an article similar to this about lawmakers pushing grocery industry for transparency on profits, the co-op model does that for us. And just as a quick note, because yes, food co-ops that focus on natural organic foods are generally more expensive than any other grocery store. Part of that is because we're focused on a different category of foods altogether, which are organic foods, which are generally more expensive to produce for obvious reasons, local foods, where we're paying people more fair wages that aren't relied on cheap migrant labor, as an example. So there's reasons why there's difference in pricing. But as co-ops become more powerful, which they have in recent years, my co-op on the left is the Kootenai Co-op, Canada's largest grocer, owns one of our competitors in Nelson. I've walked into these stores, I do this quite regularly, and when you compare identical products, our co-op is competitive with the largest grocer in Canada that has 30% of Canada's grocery. So that whole idea that like big grocers are always going to be cheaper because of economies of scale, when I compare identical products, that's not the case. We're a single store. We're not a member of any federation where we do buying together, which many of the co-ops in the US do. We don't do that because we don't have that available for our kind of grocery store. And I don't want you to have to analyze all this, but this is a co-op in Bellingham, Washington. They do price comparisons all the time here. So this is, Hagen, Albertsons owned, Whole Foods, Amazon owned, Fred Meyer, Kroger owned, and this is the co-op. And they're always doing these price comparisons and demonstrating that in some cases they are cheaper, most cases they're on par, some cases they're more expensive. But again, transparency, and as well demonstrating that co-ops are highly competitive. And so this is something in my co-op I saw 2 of these bags of pasta organic tortilla chips for $7. And now that I know all of these things about trust and how prices are formed, when I see this great deal, I don't sort of see it as some kind of win. I don't necessarily see it like the stores may be trying to take advantage of me and lure me into the store so it can make more money for me off all the other high margin items. I actually have this relationship to these great deals where I understand and can see that there are people in the office behind the shelves, behind the store, who actually are caring about my well-being, who are caring about my economic well-being and my health. And they're making these decisions and negotiating with these suppliers for my benefit, not for their benefit, not for the store's benefit. And case in point, on the same day we were offering this price in our co-op, these were the 3 main competitors in Nelson, 2 for $9, $5 each, over $5 each. So again, these are the 3 largest grocers in Western Canada and our single store and co-op. And you gotta be careful too. Like here's in one of those blah owned stores, $5.29 makes it look like it's some sort of low price. This is the regular price for the chips. So we also need to bring some awareness to when we see pricing that we think is good, to be aware that sometimes it's not necessarily the case. So I just want to talk about co-ops, just to give you a sense of the food co-ops in the country and what's the state of the movement. There are 325 food co-ops across the U.S. They look very different, and they all adapt to their communities. So this isn't one of those things where you drive into Grand Rapids, or you drive into Virginia, or you drive into Cambridge. These are all the things I know. Italy. I drove to Italy. Yeah. Bemidji. There you go. And you see the exact same store. It's almost as if you thought you went in a circle, right? Food co-ops are responding to their community's needs, and you can see that in how they look. And I'll share a little bit about my co-op. This is what my co-op looked like in 2006. So again, Nelson, 11,000 people. My co-op in 2016, I was still there on board. We did a paid job, but we were growing so rapidly that we needed another building. We were doing 14 million at this point in 2016 in this tiny store, 5,000 square feet. And we needed another place to grow. And one of the buildings that became available was this building at the other end of the downtown, owned, or at least the banner and the business owned by Loblaw. So this is a Loblaw banner, but the building and the land is owned by a local couple. And rather than renew the lease for Loblaw, they decided to sell the business or the building and the land to us. So we acquired the land for $3.5 million, the whole block related to the city. And we came up with a really ambitious plan to build a mixed-use development, which our store would fill the bottom. And then we would build these residential units, sell the residential units, and at the end of it, we would own the bottom of the building and own our store, which would be 12,000 square feet, and then another 5,000 or 6,000 square feet of warehouse space and office space. And we were able to do this because we reached out to our owners and asked our owners to loan us $1.5 million. Our owners stepped up and lent $1.8 million, 175 owners. We had one lender lend $250,000. I know your capital campaign model is different than loans, but we were able to do this because we've been around for many decades. And 1.8 million, and then the rest of it was financed through credit unions. So it was all cooperatives that ended up funding the development of this building. And we put up the first construction crane in Nelson's history. It's front page news. And coming back to the image you've already seen, this is again what that building looks like today. And so the impact of this grocer on our community has been profound. It meant we could hire more people, and of course sell more product. We now sell $29 million of product through that store. We employ 154 staff, pay over $6 million in wages and benefits. We're the largest private employer in the city.
Where was your city? Where is that?
Nelson, British Columbia.
British Columbia.
Yep, Nelson, British Columbia. So we're 3 hours north of Spokane, if you picture a map. This is our produce department. We've chosen to stay entirely organic because there are 3 other big grocery options in an immediate area, so we don't feel the need to serve all of those needs. But some co-ops, who are opening in areas without any grocery store, will have both conventional and organic. So food co-ops aren't synonymous with natural organic foods. It's whatever we as a community want our co-op to be, right? And co-ops most often have seating areas and cafes, which we never had in our old store, but we do now. So it means we can host events here. It's a place to connect and gather. And something we also do, and what many co-ops do, and this is actually what distinguishes an independent co-op from any other grocery stores, we make all of what we see in here inside the store. So it means we can control our ingredients, we can use local ingredients, anything on the produce department that's maybe nearing its expiration date can go immediately into the kitchen before we have to throw it out, and it can go into a product that's going to be sold right away. And so many co-ops do what I guess you could call vertical integration, right? We integrate into other parts of the food supply chain. So we actually start to control more of the supply chain. So we're not just the recipient and at the mercy of all these private interests. We start to take control over food production, food manufacturing. It means we can employ more people, like my next door neighbor, who works in the store here. He's one of the bakers. And we also have a meat department, which also means we can support local meat producers, which we never could do before. in our previous small store. So we have a full meat department where we can bring in sides of beef and pork and process those on site, turn them into sausages. Everything you see here is made inside the store. And I don't want you to get the wrong idea that this is something your co-op's going to be able to do right away, but this is what co-ops can work towards and what many that have been around for many decades are able to now integrate into their businesses. But to get to this place, we need to invest in our store, we need to shop at the store so that it can grow and it can start to have this kind of impact. And not only that, but secure the supply chains that we rely on, right? So we're not at the mercy of one or two companies that control the meat industry or the pork industry or chicken. Some co-ops, like the one in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which has a second store in Rochester, Minnesota, acquired a bakery just recently. So this bakery down here on the bottom right is going to go out of business, and the co-op wanting to secure its supply chain, bought the bakery, and now owns the bakery, because this is an important product the co-op provided. This co-op in Keene, New Hampshire, very young co-op actually, I think only about 20 years old. You can see it back here. This was a building that was a food manufacturing facility that was being used by some of the co-op suppliers, but those suppliers became so successful, in part because of the co-op, that they needed a bigger space. So the co-op has since bought this facility and is now going to start to manufacture its own products in it as well. And here's another just interesting example that co-ops don't need to necessarily just focus on grocery in smaller neighborhoods like Plainfield, Vermont, smaller communities. This co-op needed to grow and it had nowhere to grow, but this hardware store was for sale. So the grocery co-op came in and bought the hardware store. So now the community owns not only the grocery store, but they own the hardware store and they own the garden center. That's part of this business, right? And I spoke of two co-ops meeting the needs of the community. So this People's Food Co-op location in Rochester, Minnesota, when you walk into their produce department, on the left is conventional produce and on the right is organic. So that might also be determined too by what the members want or what they can afford. So olive oil is becoming really expensive. So the co-op over in Virginia, Natural Harvest, has both an organic olive oil and a non-organic olive oil. And that's because, some of us might not be able to afford the $20 organic liter of olive oil. The non-organic is $17. So you save a few dollars. And so the co-op is offering that because that's what members need, right? I'm going to just fast forward over this. I want to talk about the ways that once a co-op starts to generate revenues and profits and is successful, it becomes really a community development institution in and of itself. So these are all the organizations that my co-op, now 50 years old, is contributing to either financially or through donations, food donations. I believe we're up to about $160,000 a year supporting all of these nonprofits. Church groups, choirs, soccer clubs, schools. And one of the programs we do is once a month, here on the right, we give 3% of our daily sales to a local nonprofit. And we've been doing this now for 20 years, at least 20 years. So when I got there at our co-op in 2006, we were doing about $7 million in sales a year. We now do $29 million in sales a year. But this number here never changed. So as we grow as a co-op, so do the organizations that we support. So does our contribution. So as we grow, so does the community. And that's the really, I think, even more today than ever before, importance of a co-op is that funding for nonprofits, a lot of it is dried up, a lot of it's been cut, and co-ops have become even more important as an institution that can support these organizations. And we do it with, I think, a more sustainable, secure source of revenues, which is a grocery store. So we are all spending money in our communities all the time on food. We can then take that money and support the rest of our community through the co-op model. And unlike, changes of administration every 4 years, changes in ideology that may reduce the amount of funding available to these nonprofits, we can be more secure in what these organizations offer our community, because that doesn't happen in the co-op. It could happen, with the change of directors, but I haven't seen it happen where all of a sudden co-ops say, no, we're not going to support these groups anymore. Unless, of course, they're not financially doing well, which can happen. And just another interesting example, too, of a co-op can become whatever your community wants it to be, and it can also secure its supply chain. This is a tiny co-op in Ontario. Good Food Co-op opened in 2016. It's focused a lot of its product on cafe. So this is the retail store. On the right is just the beginning of the cafe, and they have a really large kitchen. They cater events, they cater weddings. They have a huge menu. And food service is a big part of what co-ops do. So it's not just selling food, it's also creating a place to gather and eat prepared foods, which of course younger generations are more interested in. And it also can mean, like, as a co-op once a week, like this co-op and many co-ops in the US offer these really accessible, affordable meals, like once a week at $3 dinner. Where you can come in and get a really affordable dinner. Some co-op sports at $4 or $5 depending on their costs. So this is just something else too to imagine for your co-op, which I know you're already imagining, which is having a food service and food that's available to eat right away. So bringing this just back to startups. Here's an example of a startup I visited on my book tour. So I visited your co-op or your startup in 2019. We met at the library there over here in Grand Rapids. This is another one I visited on that book tour, book release tour. And they did what your co-op is doing. You know, drew up plans, just like you have there in the back, and outside there. So they campaigned at events, put out signs. Do you have signs, lawn signs? Do you ever do that? Not every co-op does that. They did this thing with the lawn signs. They ran a community investment campaign. So for them, it was $4.35 million, which was at a time where the cost of building a grocery store was a little less than it is today. They raised $1.75 million from their owners, sent out messages. Why did you invest? I hope you have some new ideas for me as to why you invested or choose to invest or will. And here's what the store looks like today in their grand opening. And so this is where you are, almost. And so yeah, in as much time as I can offer, that's really the highlights of how I think we want to start to think about our co-ops, the future of co-ops, why they impact our communities. We're at 12:30. How about, I'm happy to stay for another 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes of questions, conversation. Everybody good for that?
Yeah.
I promised John we'd be on the road by 1 in his goal.
Yeah, and I was generous with that too, you know, as far as